Hello, fellow foodies. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Cassandra Quave, your host of Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. Today on the show, we're going to explore an interesting concept that is especially relevant not only to food security, but also to food sovereignty. We're going to be talking about famine foods. Our guest today is Dr. Paul Minnis. He's a professor emeritus of anthropology at the University of Oklahoma and now lives in Tucson, Arizona, where he's a visiting scholar at the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. Paul conducts research on the pre-Hispanic ethnobotany and archaeology of the Northwest Mexico and the U.S. Southwest. He has published extensively on ethnobotany with a special interest in food and anthropogenic ecology. He's the author or editor of 14 books and numerous articles. And his most recent book is called Famine Foods, Plants We Eat to Survive. And this was just released last year with the University of Arizona Press. In Famine Foods, Paul focuses on the myriad plants that have sustained human populations throughout the course of history, unveiling those that people have consumed and often still consume to avoid starvation. For the first time, his book offers a fascinating overview of famine foods, how they're used, who uses them, and perhaps most importantly, why they may be critical to sustaining human life in the future. So, thanks so much for coming on the show, Paul. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Cassandra. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah. So, why don't we just start with the basics? What can you share with our audience about what famine foods are?
Well, there are several different definitions. One of them is the most common one, I think, or people think that there are foods that people eat only when they're starving.
Okay.
And I prefer a broader definition as an anthropologist, looking at foods that people eat when there are food shortages. So they can be common foods that are eaten in unusual ways. They can be common foods that are eaten in um, greater abundance, in addition to foods that are only eaten when people are starving. And so there's a range of thousands of these sorts of famine foods. There is a database hosted by Purdue by Robert Friedman, who over decades accumulated 13,000
Wow.
cards about human consumption. And you have a subset of famine foods, and he lists about 1,700 famine foods that are recorded to have been used. And this is, I think, an only small fraction. You know, the Kew Garden lists about 28,000 known medicinal plants, and it's probably higher by now. And
Hmm.
that's not all of the known medicinal plants. And I have a hard time thinking that foods eaten when people are starving, plants eaten when people are starving, is any fewer than medicinal plants. So,
Hmm.
you know, 28,000, 30,000 famine foods in the world is not unusual. And yet we only have really good documentation of 1,700, which is what, 6% or something. So there's a lot to be learned. But it's not just the plants themselves. It's an interaction of society, environment, and botany. And so it's not just the characteristics of the plants, it's the characteristics of the human society. So different kinds of societies, given their types of economies, et cetera, and population densities, utilize famine foods in very, very different ways. And to get a fuller understanding of that, that's why I like the definition of famine foods being those things that people eat when there are shortages, rather than a small subset of plants that are only eaten during famines.
That's a really good point. And I'm wondering, when you think about the context of famine foods over the course of human history, I mean, we've had societies that are more focused on hunting and gathering and societies that are more based in agriculture. Do famine foods play a role in kind of both of those spaces? Or are they more of something that agricultural peoples would have relied on as a secondary source of food?
There have literally been thousands of recorded famines in human history, and who knows how many that have never been recorded. I can't imagine that there isn't a society of any organization that hasn't had
Hmm.
severe food shortages. What that means, frankly, to put it in personal terms, is if your ancestors hadn't have survived a famine, you wouldn't be here. And one of the main ways to survive famines is to eat foods that you normally wouldn't eat. So they've been critical for sustaining humanity for a long period of time. Literally, famines, every part of the world has had famines. Um, the Western Hemisphere had fewer numbers recorded, but I don't know if how much of that's just a function of a lack of recording. Uh, and they changed. So Europe had a lot of famines until the 1900s, and then they didn't have many famines until war hit.
Mm.
Uh, the 19th century, there were a lot of famines in India, etc. So they aren't even over time and over areas. But I'm willing to bet there isn't a society over time that have never had to deal with food shortages. So it's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It's one of those things people have had to just deal with for millennia.
Yeah,
And so it's really an important concept, I think.
that's a really good point. I mean, do you think that I mean, have famines basically have they shaped human history in some ways?
Well, they
Or
may limit population to some degree,
mhm.
but what they make they require people to think outside the box of their normal lives. It affects various things. For example, one of the ways that information is passed down is in ritual knowledge, so it involves religion as well. Now, think about it. I mean, people learn how to use foods like plants from
Mhm.
their parents or their grandparents, and it's a daily occurrence. You have to pretty much eat every day or every 2 days, whatever. Famine foods, you think about that information could be easily lost, couldn't it? If there wasn't
Yeah.
a famine for one or two generations, how's that information perpetuated? So it's a very fragile, I think, kind of knowledge, ethnobotanical knowledge. And interestingly, one of the ways it's perpetuated is in myths, stories, and religious activities. So the Zuni Indians, for example, for their ceremonies today, they have a liturgy which includes naming off plants, plus certain plants are important components of the religious practices. It means that knowledge about those plants is perpetuated, not as famines, but as part of important ritual sacred knowledge. And so there's a lots of ways that it focus society. It nowadays it's a problem because of how dense populations are, and when you look at famines today, it's changed the way you interact between cultures. So nowadays, relief supplies are one of the primary forms of famine foods, but
Yeah.
they always don't work. There are people in Yemen and the Tigray province that are starving today.
Mm.
And while there may be food around them, it isn't available.
This is really
So I think it's
interesting.
been important.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
I was just thinking back to, some of my early field work with Andrea Pironi in southern Italy. We looked at
Mhm.
liacra, which are wild edible greens consumed by ethnic Albanian populations living in southern Italy. And there'd been this period of transition where at one point, not necessarily from famine, but more of a food scarcity situation, especially during the war, where these were kind of wild foods that were prepared and eaten as a supplement to the diet. But there's also a lot of stigma around the consumption of what would be considered perhaps subpar foods. But then on the other hand, with kind of the resurgence of this interest in foraging, we've seen now things that were once stigmatized as poverty foods, famine foods, things that you would just, collect because you didn't have any other choice, to now being celebrated as this kind of foraging, delight. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. Have you seen that in other cultures as well? This kind of,
Well,
yeah.
it's very very common. There's work in Italy, also like Greece
Hmm.
for during the World War II, and Spain. In fact, there's an article, I can't remember where it is, that compares knowledge of the use of greens across the Mediterranean different cultures.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's really common. There are foods that are famine foods because they are hard to prepare. They aren't very common, or they're tabooed.
Hmm.
And there are cases, for example, of India, of some high class Brahmin women starving to death rather than eating foods that they shouldn't be eating.
Wow.
I think that's the exception. I think if you read enough stories about famines, people eat whatever they can.
Yeah.
They just have to. And and so a lot of foods that they normally wouldn't eat, that were stigmatized, were considered
Hmm.
low class, they'll eat them, and sometimes they'll try to eat them surreptitiously where people can't see.
Hmm.
But I think they'll eat them.
So,
And it is wonderful how nowadays local foods and exotic foods have a cachet where perhaps for our parents or our grandparents there were things to be avoided,
yeah.
whereas we avoid Jello now.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. Yeah, a lot of the kind of 1950s processed things. Well, uh, one question I have is that I think I'm sure some of the audience might have is, could you give us a bit of detail about around the characteristics that famine foods share? Are they undesirable because they're difficult to process? Do they not taste good? What are some of the why are they differentiated from things that we do want to actively eat versus things that are kind of as a back burner option?
The answer is yes. uh, but the longer answer is they can be not very nutritious.
Mhm.
So it's not uncommon for people to grind up corn cobs and use that to extend wheat or flour. Corn cobs have almost nowadays no nutritional value for humans
Mm.
at all. So there are plants that people eat that just don't have much nutrition, but one could argue that some nutrition or a sense of satiety,
Mhm.
which is important for people that are starving, people eat those things. There are foods that are despised for cultural reasons or for religious reasons. There are foods that take a lot of work to prepare. They can either be poisonous
Mhm.
or they can be bitter and taste bad, and they require some kinds of manipulation. They can also be really low density foods that people wouldn't normally get because they're just not around in enough of a density to collect. They're not worth collecting. But if you're starving, they're probably worth collecting. So there are just a whole variety of cultural and biological reasons why people would not eat these things normally. That when they're starved, when they're really facing starvation, they'll eat almost anything. Um, and it's not only just the nutrition, but it's also the sense of satiety. There's a kaolin clay in China, and there's geophagia, as you know, is fairly common
Mhm.
throughout the world. But there's this special kind of clay people would eat a little bit of, and during the famines, people would eat large quantities of it uh, just to get a feeling of being full. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, the clay then basically becomes concrete in the gastrointestinal
Oh,
tract and
no.
causes all kinds of problems. So it's not just nutrition, but it's also a sense of satiety. Let me give you an interesting example of, and we could talk about this later, is by looking cross culturally at famine foods, you find out there's stuff that you couldn't imagine is edible that is edible.
Mhm.
So where I live in Western North America, there's something called Tribulus terrestris, or goat's head. People hate it. If you walk dogs, ride a bicycle, or go barefoot, you hate it. It has these nutlets with incredibly strong spines that lacerate feet, dogs' paws, and bicycle tires.
Mm.
People just hate it with a passion. And it would really surprise all of us in Western North America to know that these goat's heads or puncture vine was a major famine food in parts of Africa and India. You can grind the nutlets up, which really don't provide a whole lot of nutrition according to FAO, but the green plants as a greens are really very nutritious. So
Hmm.
here's a plant that nobody in where I live likes it, but it's really been a lifesaver. Millions of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of people's lives have been saved by this plant. Where you are, we have kudzu,
Yeah.
which I don't know. I've never lived in the Southeast. Can't imagine that anybody in the Southeast thinks much of kudzu. It's a horrible invasive
Mhm.
weed from Japan that eats up buildings and trees and everything else. In fact, kudzu roots are a good famine food in Papua New Guinea, and actually they're eaten in Southeast Asia as well. And so you can learn all kinds of things about plants that you never knew, even plants that you thought in these horrible invasives really have saved lives. over millennia is quite surprising. And so there's just a lot to be learned about these and why. So part of that's just ignorance. It's not. It's people are often ignorant. One other point I'd like to make is there are a number of studies where people have looked at knowledge of edible foods in culturally similar villages nearby each other,
Mm-hmm.
and what you would expect, of course, is that they would have exactly the same knowledge, but that's not even the case. So not only is this ignorance cross continental, but it's even in village next to another village that they don't necessarily, a visitor from one village can go over and say, hey, these people don't know there's this thing is edible. And so the knowledge is often very localized, not always, but often. And this is why a comparative study of famine foods is important. It opens up a range of possibilities of what's eaten, and not only famines, that as we can talk later on, maybe some of these famine foods may have value beyond just feeding people during food shortages.
Yeah, this is a really good point. We've talked a lot on the show about wild crop relatives and their importance for shoring up kind of our genetic our gene banks for future crop breeding initiatives. But I would expect that likely there are a number of famine foods that might be crop wild relatives in themselves that are kind of in those edible genera. Um, and I want to go back to one point you mentioned about clay because this is interesting. And this is a food that we have access to really across most of the US, and those are acorns. And I've read about the creation of acorn bread from the nuts that are ground up into a flour, but they contain a lot of tannins, which are not great to consume in large quantities. And so, clay is added to the bread in some cases, or they're leached in clay to help bind up some of those toxic constituents. But most people wouldn't think, looking at an oak tree, oh, that's a great source for me to make bread, or, or a food that could be
Yeah.
really filling. Yeah, yeah.
Let me mention one thing you just raised, and that is the wild plants being particularly maybe having value in cultivation.
Mhm.
How about a little tangent here? And this
Yeah.
relates to a previous book I edited, and that is, as we know, the world is dependent on largely 12 to 20 plants, and people are really were nervous about that. Putting all of your eggs in one basket is not a good thing. And there's literally been over 100 years of people going out and collecting the seeds of poorly known land races and storing them in the doomsday seed vault or the corn vault in Ames, Iowa, etc. So people have done that for a long time. What they don't think about is, and this is where being an archaeologist comes in handy, there are all kinds of crops that we know of in prehistory that are now extinct.
Hmm.
So the crop inventory of what we know today is not a sum of history because history can be lost. And where you are in Eastern North America, there's a whole suite of ancient crops developed in North America, which fed the ancient peoples until corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, became so important in about AD 900. So for thousands of years, they developed these things like marsh elder and others.
Hmm.
And those may be valuable. I mean, we know that they have been
Yeah.
domesticated. And so maybe they can be domesticated in the future. Uh, Also, in getting back, that was a little aside, but on the same point, Bob Freeman, out of his database, has about 7 or 8 plants. He says, look, these are ones we really ought to look at. That they're known as famine foods, but they have some really unusual or specific nutritional value that might be worthwhile exploiting and either domesticating or using them more. So, yeah, wild plants are a major kind of famine food, and there is some value potentially for these things in the future uh, as potential domesticates. It doesn't cost much. I mean, we just spent $10 billion sending the Webb, $10 billion sending the Webb telescope, and God bless them, it's really wonderful. But anthropologists and botanists work cheap, and especially people,
Unfortunately,
yeah,
yeah, too cheap.
especially those who go into the field. And so to get an inventory of these ancient crops or modern famine foods doesn't cost that much. It's really inexpensive.
Yeah.
And I think we put some effort into it, and I think the rewards might pay off.
Well, one thing that concerns me is we have this lost knowledge that needs to be recaptured. I mean, from the history of foods for sure. But what concerns me is the loss of the people that can do this. I mean, botany programs across the US have just been wiped out. So who are you going to send into the field when we're not training the next generation of people that can actually go out and identify and document this kind of information and collect the specimens? That's a bigger issue. But yeah, I think we definitely need to have funding to support these kinds of initiatives to ensure our food security. We have to be training the next generation of scientists to do it too.
Well, one of the advantages with famine foods and ethnobiology, as you know,
Hmm.
is that the places where there's so much of this knowledge exists are places like India and Mexico and China. And it's an inexpensive kind of science to do, and it's in their own country. And so, one thing that struck me is Society of Ethnobiology, when we had our meeting in Mexico, the large number of students that were
Mm,
interested in this.
yeah.
And it's not an expensive kind of science to do. And so it's kind of fortunate, probably in the countries where this knowledge is still there and extant and easily gotten, there are scholars in India and China
Hmm.
and Latin America who can do it. And so not it's all lost, but it's important. One other point related to this is when I got started in this and reading about famine foods, what struck me is the biologists who do this give a scientific name, maybe a common name, and maybe a little bit of information, but all the cultural context, which is very important, is lost.
Mm.
And when you read histories and anthropologies of famines or food shortages, it is so frustrating. What you hear is they ate bark, weeds, and grass, and that's not very useful.
Yeah.
And so it requires not only botanists, but it requires social scientists of various kinds, anthropologists, sociologists,
Hmm.
historians, and biologists working together with local populations to get both getting both kinds of information together to get a fuller understanding. And it's amazing how few reports there are that do that give detailed biological identifications and information, as well as the kind of cultural context which is critical for understanding what's going on. And obviously, it has to be in collaboration with local groups. And
Yeah.
and and again, that's the thing that really needs to be done. It's inexpensive, and there is some. As I said earlier, I think this knowledge is very fragile and is more easily lost than most knowledge. And so it's really it'd be good to get on it.
Yeah. No,
It's not
absolutely.
always lost.
Well, I'm
Yeah, it's
thinking
not
about
always
like,
lost in the. Go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was just saying, thinking about like local farm like stakeholders, communities that are growing different varieties and different land races. I mean, I know that some of these are being collected for gene banks, but I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know of places that are collecting both the biological, the genetic materials, along with the anthropological data on when did they plant these particular varieties or under what conditions, if it's a heavy rainfall year or a low rainfall, or if it, all of those details that go into why they select certain varieties in different years to grow. I think a lot of that's missing.
Well, there is this organization in Tucson,
Hmm.
Native Seed Search,
Okay.
which has a gene bank of local things in the Northwest Mexico and Southwest United States, and it is very the board of directors is heavily indigenous peoples, and they work closely with them, and so it isn't just a bunch of botanists collecting botanically interesting things, so they have genetic information, but it's wider than that. I see more and more indigenous peoples in North America getting interested. I taught in Oklahoma for 32 years, and there didn't seem to be a whole lot of interest in indigenous foods in Oklahoma until I got toward the end. And I must say, as an archaeologist, I was working elsewhere, so I wasn't doing anything to help the
Hmm.
situation, I have to admit. But at the end, there are a lot of groups, local groups that from the bottom up were starting to be interested in preserving this part of their heritage. The Cherokee, for example, have a whole seed bank. There's some Pawnee women who were corn ladies who were trying on their own to preserve this special kind of corn. And so I saw this all over Oklahoma. And I think you're getting more and more people interested, indigenous peoples interested, not just in Oklahoma, but other parts of North America in their botanical and culinary heritage, and are trying to save that. And that can only be a good thing. So I'm ever hopeful in that regard.
That's great. No, I think that's the best way to preserve knowledge is living knowledge in practice. I mean, that's fantastic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm wondering, thinking about the botany also, how widely distributed are famine foods? Are there certain plant families that you find are more heavily represented, like the daisy family, or I don't know, like
Bean
are
family,
the bean family?
basically.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
If you take Freeman's database, which is the best database, what's interesting, there are 190 families recognized. And I think the Kew Garden recognizes, 440 or so plant families. So even in this small, I think relatively small famine food database, 40% of the families, botanical families, have at least one famine food recognized. That suggests that it's all over everywhere, and there are a lot of them. There are about 20 of those families or 25 of where there in that database, there are at least 20 species or more. The one that stands out is the bean family. It had 168 species, not surprisingly.
Oh.
And there's some that have a lot of plants that don't have many famine foods, and there are a few things that have a lot of famine foods and not many plants. So it's not evenly distributed, but the fact that 40% of the known plant families have at least one famine food in this small database suggests that they're just all over everywhere, from tree bark to mushrooms. Well, we won't do mushrooms because that's not really a plant family, but almost, I think orchids, there's one orchid or something in the orchid family. They aren't really big. And so it's widespread, and if people had to look anywhere to start with, it would be, they'd be looking at the bean family. There's a lot of regional variation too. So if you look at the site in that famine food book, I obviously couldn't cover the entire world. So I looked at 14 case studies. And for example, if you look at the circumpolar area,
Mm-hmm.
berries, plants aren't the most important thing in the circumpolar area. They're meat and fish eaters, but berries are the particularly important famine foods. Whereas in other areas, it tends to be seeds and fruits, not berries. And these are obviously popular terms, not botanical terms. And in China, it's greens. Incredible number of greens are known. So there's regional variation. Obviously, in the area I work at, in the Southwest and Northwest Mexico, cacti, succulents
Interesting. Yeah.
are particularly important. So they're all over botanically. I think they're probably the majority of plant families have famine foods, because we know that 40% do. But that it all varies on the basis of the environment and also the culture. Bark. Bark is really important in the subpolar regions. Like if you go into Scandinavia, bark is an incredibly important. In fact, the recipes for bark bread, never made any,
Wow.
but bark bread is. You can get on the internet and look up bark bread, and there are recipes for bark bread. But
Wow.
other people use bark as well. The cambium is actually pretty nutritious. It's a lot of work to collect. I think is a big problem, but cambium is actually very, very nutritious plant part. You have to get rid of the bark, and it's a lot of work to get a little bit. But say up in Sweden and Finland and Norway, bark bread is a part of the cultural heritage and was an important famine food, which I don't think most of us would think about.
That's a really good point. Too, this concept of famine foods, when we think of someone that's starving, I guess the image that comes to mind in my head from, movies and things is like you're foraging, trying to just eat things raw, right? But it sounds like many of these famine foods are actually processed in some way, either through cooking or kind of cleaning them up and preparing them in different ways. Is that accurate, or are these primarily transformed into another kind of food from the base material?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on what. I mean, if that's all, if all you have is something that requires a lot of transformation, then you're going to do it. I think one of the other things that's important is how severe the famine is. When you first have, or just a severe food shortage,
Hmm.
when you first have it, you may have some effort and community efforts to do things, and you have, but when you really get down to the very, very worst, just before people die, and a lot of folks don't have much energy, and so it's hard to forage
Yeah.
long distance or do a lot of processing. And so that's why I think you need to look at this as a process, and view that a famine isn't just people are eating really well and then they're nearly dead. It takes a while, and people adjust their strategies, whether it be migration or using various kinds of famine foods, some that require processing, some that don't. Is depend on sort of the condition. And processing food, as you know, Tim Johns is, I think, what is he has 160 plants that are very common foods that are
Hmm.
toxic or something like that, require a lot
Yeah.
of processing. So people are really used to manipulating plants, grinding them or leaching them or whatever to get the stuff
Hmm.
out that they don't want to eat. So it's a part of the human repertoire of survival. And they
Yeah.
use this in food shortages as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think I teach a class at Emory called Food Health and Society, and when we talked about the processing of foods, I think that many people have this different perception of what it means to process a food because we think of it in the industrial context, but actually it's, in many societies it is the act of roasting or boiling or grating or leaching or pounding or drying, fermenting, all these different things you can do
Or
to
all of the above.
all of the above, some mix of all the above, and I'm a huge fermentation fan as one of the transformation methods because, it just yields so many value added products that store so
Right.
well. But even the act of drying can help reduce some of those toxic constituents depending on the species and also add to like longevity of the food product kind of. Yeah. So lots of interesting um, principles there as well. Well,
I mean,
mhm. Go ahead.
you just have to think of manioc or cassava, which feeds hundreds of millions of people in the tropics, and what they have to go to get the hydrocyanic acid out and just get a good edible starch. But people do it, and it's a major crop for folks. So it's part humans know how to do this mostly. Though there are
Yeah.
examples. There are examples of people being poisoned eating unfamiliar foods. I think a lot of it are mimics. People often migrate during food shortages, and they come across a biota that's somewhat a little bit different than what they're used to, and they see a plant that looks like something they think is edible, and they eat it and they get sick or die. So there are examples. It doesn't happen that often, but there are examples of people eating mimics that are poisonous. So knowledge is not perfect, as we all know, and there are examples of people dying because of eating things that they shouldn't have eaten.
Well, this kind of ties into a question I often get from people. I'm often asked, how did humans over time figure out which plants could be useful as foods or medicines? And I'm wondering what your perspective is on this. Knowing what you do about famine foods, like what are your thoughts?
People just try stuff.
Yeah.
You try a lot of stuff. Some things don't taste good, and that tends to be an indication it may not be really good for you. Experimentation,
Hmm.
and it isn't as if people try stuff and then half the people keel over dead from trying it, but there are, chemical and taste clues about what are edible and what's not edible. Um, and so, I think it's just a lot of experimentation. I mean, as an archaeologist, I think in terms of 1,000 years or 10,000
Hmm.
years, and then that's a lot of experience. People going out and trying to make a living and learning from others, and so I think it's nothing very fancy. It's just people are experimenting, trying different things, find some things work, some things don't work, and going from there
That's
for the
right.
most part.
So, what do you think then the future of famine foods is? Like based on where we are now, where do you think we're going in the future?
Well, it would be very nice if we no longer had any food shortages, now wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But,
With
and
monocropping, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to definitely have more food shortages with disease
well,
and
it's going to be
crops.
that and conflict. I think
Yeah.
most of the really bad famines in the 20th century are based on war and conflict,
Mm.
and or bad economic policy. So, for example, the famine during the Great Leap Forward in 1958 to 1961, which isn't that long ago for many of us,
Yeah.
killed 20 million to 30 million people in China.
Wow.
Mainly there were some environmental reasons, but it was mainly just really stupid economic planning.
Mm.
And it's the same kind of stuff that happened in Russia with in the 1930s with the Kazakh famine, and the famine in Ukraine called the Holodomor. So basically, they did the same thing, and these were conflicts or bad political decisions. And if you look at Europe, by the 1900s, there were very few famines until World War I and World War II, and then all hell broke loose. And so
Mm.
I think those are the considerations. There are issues of monoculture and increasing population, and I think that all leads into conflict between people and the lethality of war and what that does, particularly to civilian populations. And famines are very common. In fact, the last, what was it, 4 case studies I do are looking at urbanized states at war. The Netherlands and Siege of Leningrad is really a sad thing to read
Oh,
about.
yeah.
Uh, Netherlands, which is the most interesting example in Greece.
Hmm.
Um, and so the future is, so the point is, I'm not a pessimist, but the famines have been with us or food shortages for a long time. They're going on right now. As I say, Yemen had a serious problem. Tigray
Hmm.
province in Ethiopia is getting on to people's cognition. There were even
Mm.
starvation during the Bosnian War in the 1990s. So, it's if international relief can get to people, it can help, but that doesn't always happen. So I think food shortages are always going to be there. And I think collecting the information potentially offers maybe not a great solution, but one of the strategies people can use to survive. And also, it gets with food sovereignty. This isn't just outside knowledge, this is local knowledge that people
Hmm.
themselves can control. So I'm not arguing that the use of famine foods will solve famines and death, but they're one tool in the toolbox that I don't think has gotten enough uh, play. In addition, for the future, is some of these plants may be useful in foods. As you mentioned earlier, they're among wealthy places. Local, non-cultivated, indigenous foods are really kind of popular and in and hip, whatever the term
Hmm.
is nowadays. I'm dating myself. And some of these foods might make a perfectly interesting food. There's a wonderful example. I can't remember the specifics, but there are 2 famine foods in Laos that were particularly mentioned, and one of them has become a really hot, popular item in some of the upscale restaurants in Southeast Asia and Australia. And I can't remember which plant it was. So there may be some future there, and some of these things may be able to be cultivated and provide another layer of breadth to the kind of food base that humanity needs to go into the future. So I think there's an important future for study of famine foods. It's not a solution to anything, but it's part of the solution, and it doesn't require a lot of money or effort or
Hmm.
work. It requires people, and people are cheap.
Yeah.
Uh, it requires people, and it's simple and collaboration. And we need to get this before populations just become so completely urbanized that they've lost really strong connections with um,
Local food
local development.
traditions.
So, for
Yeah.
example, let me give you an example. Like in Papua New Guinea, there was a famine. I can't remember, in the 1990s, a food shortage, and people in the highlands, 90% of them used famine foods. The people in the urban area, like Port Moresby, only 50% did. And so that's just a kind of a statistical indication about as things get more urbanized, we lose kind of the close botanical connection we have with local environments and knowledge. And we don't want to lose that. We want to get that information as fully as we can.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, the connectivity that we have, or the lack of connectivity to nature and to these resources, I think definitely declines in those more urbanized environments. I mean, the sad truth is today, many people couldn't recognize a crop plant of some of our common vegetables and fruits if it doesn't have a big fruit hanging off of it. I mean, we're very separated from our food systems today within the industrial food system. Um, but, this leads to the last question I have for you, Paul, is, you know, thinking about all this and in recognition of the incredible importance that famine foods have had for throughout human history and the inevitability of future food shortages, of future famines, as we've seen time and again over history. It's going to happen. Um, what can we do to raise awareness about famine foods, particularly those famine foods that might be, relevant to certain regions of the world? So, like regional databases. I mean, what are your thoughts on how to increase awareness of how to identify, collect, and transform these resources into food?
Yeah, no, it's incredibly frustrating. If you look up Amazon and type in French cuisine in books, you get thousands.
Mm-hmm.
People are interested in food as nutrition, as a pleasure, an absolute pleasure, and as a part of identity, but not as survival.
Mm.
Um, and so I don't understand why this has been ignored for so long. Um, that's one reason I did the famine food book, because I wanted a broad comparison, comparative study of famine foods, maybe to get some juices flowing. There are some people who are more and more getting interested in this. There is the most wonderful famine food book is called the Zhuang Ben Cao, and God forgive me for my pronunciation of Chinese. It was produced in late 1400s by Zuzu, Prince Zuzu, Henan province. It's a list of 414 famine foods.
Oh.
It is the most unbelievable piece of work. And not only did he do that, and his son continued it, but he had gardens to test some of these and grow them. It is for something in the 1400s. It's just absolutely unbelievable. And I always wonder, of all the then following famines, did any of that information get particularly used? Did governments, for example, provide that information to anybody?
Mm.
I don't know. But the thing that's hopeful is there have been two new reprints of Jiang Ben Cao. Don't ask me to spell it. In Published in China, and
Okay.
I think the movement of interested in wild foods, even though it's not directly famine foods, the Yule
Mm-hmm.
Gibbons and the survivalists, all
Mm-hmm.
of that, people are more and more interested in not in wild foods, not so much as the main source to eat, but as something that's interesting and different,
Yeah.
and that can be transformed into potentially eating. It's a bit of a problem because you take in Tucson, where I live, there are 1 million people in the greater Tucson area, and if there was a famine here, how much do you think 1 million people could easily forage without completely destroying it? So there are
Yeah.
issues there. But in China and in India, I know the Society of Ethnobiologists of India, there are various people who have focused on famine foods among particularly tribal groups.
Mm-hmm.
What frustrates me so much is when I read about famines, so much of it is the political economy, like market considerations, the price of rice, and those things, fluctuations. And that's absolutely critical. But I wish people spent 1/10 of the time they spend on market, economists spend on market situations during food shortages, and would actually look at some of these alternative foods. So I think there's some small there's not a lot of direct interest in famine foods, but there are things like foraging and other sort of or refining, rediscovering traditional heritages
Mm-hmm.
that tangentially relate to broadening the food base and famine foods. So I don't know how hopeful I am or how pessimistic. I think clearly it could use more interest, and I hope the book, and I hope Bob Freeman's database does that, but you never know.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be amazing if there were like a popular TV show or something that could capture human interest around this because I mean, it is a fascinating thing to think you can go out into nature and find things that like this very pokey plant that you were mentioning that's, stabs into your feet and your dog's paws. Like the fact that you can take a pest plant or something that you may encounter every day and just be annoyed by it, but to realize that it actually has some great utility as a food source. I mean, I think that could be something people could connect to. Um, yeah, we need to have more of that kind of education in the media, and I don't know what the right avenues are for it. Maybe a TikTok stream on edible foods. I don't know how to reach more people these days, but there's got to be a better way, because the reality is I think that while scholars will definitely look into databases and hopefully government organizations and nonprofits will consider these general I think general consumption of this knowledge is at a is pretty low. So like we've got to find a way to reach out to more people.
What I would like to see is it would not be hard for governments to gather this information and in
Mhm.
times of need to disseminate this information.
Yes.
So,
Mhm.
Dutch hunger famine, 1944. Um, do you realize what one of the major famine foods were? It's obviously, once you think about it, tulip bulbs. I mean,
Really? Yeah.
here you
Yeah.
have a country that does ornamental bulbs, and I don't know this, but I imagine during the end of World War II, there wasn't much of a
Mhm.
market for tulip bulbs, and
Yeah.
people can eat them. And the Dutch
Mhm.
government put out brochures about how you can prepare tulip bulbs and other kinds of bulbs to be eaten.
The source of food.
And
Mhm.
the thing that's a little hesitant back about that is there's probably the best study I've ever seen on famine foods is on the Dutch hunger season. Some biologists, botanists, went through diaries and all of that and listed the famine foods that were used. And they have a list of about 70.
Hmm.
And then they interviewed people 70 years afterwards who were young kids during the famine and what to see what they remembered. And they remembered maybe 20 or 30%, 40%. I can't remember the number of the foods that were on that list that came from diaries and
Hmm.
governmental reports. The thing that gives me a little pause about pushing governments at having this information and providing it is the people 70 years later, almost none of them remember the government doing anything. They learned it from their neighbors. It was common knowledge, even though the government did provide brochures and information about how to prepare all these alternative foods. So I would like governments to do that, but that one case study kind of suggests maybe you got to be kind of careful.
Through
Maybe
word
it's
of
going to be
mouth.
not as effective as. So I
Mm.
don't know. When you
Interesting.
got a place, when you got a country like ours where people haven't had a famine for I don't know how long, ever. Probably, I don't think the Great Depression
Mhm.
was the worst economic situation, and I'm sure people died of starvation, but it wasn't mainly that wasn't that common, and so we haven't faced. So people don't think about it. Why would we think about something that is not in our cultural repertoire?
Yeah.
Uh, so I don't know how you get past that. I think it's easier when you're in places where people actually have had serious famines and people have died. In the
Yeah.
Kazakh famine of the 1930s, 1.5 million Kazakhs died. They didn't become the majority in Kazakhstan until 1990 because of the death rates. And some of the
Wow.
people, we have a friend who is our age, and she remembers her grandmother talking about what she ate, eating rats, for example.
Mhm.
And so I think people who have a reasonably a history of famines or where it's a part of the identity, like Ireland. I mean, the famine of 1846 was a seminal history, part of the history of Ireland, and people remember it. But I think in the United States and Canada, it seems so removed.
Yeah, and
I
that's
mean,
a
we worry about toilet
mhm.
getting, toilet paper getting hard to find. I mean, that's sort of the level of first world problem we're dealing with, and so it's
Yeah.
hard to break through that.
Yeah, I mean, the Irish potato famine's a great example of monoculture of having a single, clone that was wiped out by a plant pathogen. that definitely
Right.
impacted human migration and the future of that country, um, in ways of that have continued for a very long time. I guess one thing I do want to dive in before I sign off, thinking about rats and thinking about foods that are beyond plants, but foods that we
Yeah.
normally would view as being completely perhaps disgusting through our cultural lens. And I'm thinking in particular of entomophagy and the consumption of insects. This is also one of those interesting topics where, in certain cultures, consumption of insects is 100% normal. It's part of the diet. There's no problem with it. And it's
Hmm.
actually a great, creates nice small economies for households that cultivate them. And there are beginning you start to see some of these trendy, chefs that are starting to feature some insects on the menu, but it really hasn't taken off. I mean, do you think that insects could play a role in helping combat famine? Or do you think like especially in the US, they're just so against it, it could never happen?
People will eat people will eat almost anything, including their examples of eating insects. I do
Mhm.
remember a number of ethnobiology meetings where somebody would get up and talk about how insects are nutritionally a food, they're sustainable, blah blah
Mhm.
blah, and we're all smiling and go, and that's it. Um, I mean, the biggest, I mean, one of the first things you see with famines are dogs and cats are missing.
Oh,
People eat
okay.
their pets.
Wow.
And then when things get worse, they eat other people. There's a big argument. Some people argue that a lot of the discussion about cannibalism really hasn't happened, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that people will eat other people, and frankly, why not if they're dead? Now there is murder; people will murder and eat them, and that's a different area. But if somebody's already dead
Mhm.
and eating them can keep it alive, as disgusting it is, it happens, and I'm
Yeah.
not going to think that that's a particularly bad thing.
Yeah.
So, rats, insects, snakes, all kinds of things that may not be considered edible, people will eat. It is, boy, when you read about famines, it's especially the really, really serious ones. It's just unbelievable. Human society falls apart,
Mm.
and people just will do what they can. It's awful, and it's something that those of us who've never experienced really, really, we can intellectually understand it, but we just can't really, really
Fathom it.
understand it in a human level. I think it's beyond us.
Yeah. There's a book I read in one of my college anthropology courses. It's called Kuru Sorcery by Linenbaum. It's about cannibalism
Mm-hmm.
in Papua New Guinea, but it was more of a ritual funerary practice that women would consume
Yes.
the relatives because they were so protein deficient. But also it led to, basically like the human version of mad cow disease, of prion disease
Right.
from eating
Right.
like the brains and
Right.
things. That book has stuck with me. I mean, it's been 25 years since I read that book, and it was so shocking to me as like an 18-year-old college student to be, but yeah.
Well, this is why when we teach intro to anthropology, as I did for 30 years, we use that example because it really shows that people often have different ideas,
Yeah.
and you know, and it's actually in those societies consuming the brain is helping that person, the deceased person, be maintained, their
Mhm.
spirit in their descendants.
Yeah.
Something that's how we would view it. Consuming dead people in famines is a very different matter. In fact, they'll dig people up sometimes from graves.
Wow.
So that's a very different situation, but it's food. And as I say, I think in most cases, not to be too cynical, is people eat whatever they can if they have to.
Yeah. Well, maybe
It's
that's an
that bad.
argument to learn about more plants so you don't have to eat your
Yes,
pets
right.
or or
There's enough
dead
promise on
bodies.
after that. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, this has been fascinating, Paul. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And again, for all the listeners out there, definitely check out his latest book. He's got a number of really fabulous books along these domains of ethnobiology, but his latest one is Famine Foods, Plants We Eat to Survive, which offers some really great case studies on these famine foods. So
And
thanks for coming. Yeah.
check out Robert Freeman's database, Famine Food. Just Google Famine Foods Purdue, and it's the
Great.
largest database you can see.
Awesome. I'll definitely be doing
Thank
that.
you
I've
very
got to
much for
beef
the
up on my
opportunity.
local famine foods.
Go to
You
McDonald's.
yeah, yeah. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. I want to send a shout out of thanks to our producers at Co-Conspiracy Entertainment, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth for producing this show. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for tuning in each week. You can find this and all of our other former episodes at our website at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also catch the video version of this episode at the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel. And of course, remember to click subscribe to wherever you listen to the podcast in your favorite streaming services. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.